Hey, good afternoon, everyone. As you know, I'm John Scott. I'm facilitating the feedback we had from the regional discussions this morning about the shape of our international network, the WIN network, the World Indigenous Network. So we're going to get we've got people from the different regions reporting back to you on the outcome of what was going on in all the different rooms. And as you know, we had a discussion with the Asian region, the African region, Pacific and Europe came together because of the numbers. It was easier for them to all sit together. Also, Latin American region came together. Then there was the North American region, and of course our Australian discussions, which were held in the plenary room. I'm going to introduce the Graceville Awah from the Philippines, and Grace is going to give us some feedback on what came out of the Asian discussions. So I'll invite Grace to come to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, first I would like to acknowledge the Larrakia Nation and the Australian government who has hosted us here. We thank you very much for this opportunity to be exchanging and networking with our other Indigenous brothers and sisters from all over the world, and also from the representatives of local communities. Just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Graceville Awah. I'm a Kankanawi Igurut. It is one of the 130 indigenous peoples in the Philippines. And I come from an organization called TEBTEBA. This is the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. And we have global partnerships, Indigenous peoples partnerships on biodiversity, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and on indigenous people's sustainable and self-determined development. So on this note, I'm here to inform you about the results of our Asia Regional Hub, and these are our proposals. We had a very fruitful discussion, and in relation to the framework and principles, we propose that the WIN should be more than simply an information sharing platform. We propose that there needs, the WIN should help indigenous peoples and local communities achieve their overall aims and aspirations. So the vision needs to be broadened and include references to rights, recognition, culture, gender, and traditional livelihoods. And in the process, it needs to empower indigenous peoples and local communities and ensure their enjoyment of rights to their territories, areas, resources, and self-determination. In relation to the aims, we include the following elements. One, on the conservation of biodiversity, it should not be limited to conservation and to biodiversity, but this should include the recognition of diverse cultures and specifically the customary use and sustainable management of resources. It should also include the enhancement of traditional and alternative livelihoods. Partnerships is an important element and should be further emphasized to support indigenous peoples and local community initiatives. We also propose further building capacities as an important aim to ensure effective engagement of the indigenous peoples and local communities at all levels of decision-making. We also propose that there should be specific indicators relevant to indigenous peoples and local communities to be further monitored and implemented. We also propose timeframes to be defined so we would know what we want to achieve within the next 5 years or 10 years or more than that. Under this, we also would like to emphasize thematic, regional, and national structures which are important basis for a strong global network. So there was a proposal to have global conferences maybe every 5 years, and that WIN and the conference should be moved around the world to be hosted in other indigenous peoples' territories. The structure of WIN needs to be further clarified. Its independence, its relationship with other processes, and the role of governments in the WIN needs to be more defined in its support for global, regional, national, and local implementation. WIN members need to be given the opportunity also to develop the agenda. It was also proposed that a clear output should come from this conference, such as resolutions or charter of demands to be considered. We also propose regional representation in the Secretariat or in other WIN committees, which would be useful for ensuring regional representation and international participation. On sustainable financing, there was an extensive discussion on the important need of this, but there are many views also about how to prioritize, what to prioritize, and where the funding should come from. A wide range of ideas were proposed, including from local, national, and international sources. And long-term support from governments are very much important and could come through endowment funds or other funds. On building an enduring network, we propose the need to build on the good work and good practices of already existing networks of indigenous peoples and local communities, which are already functional and which are successfully working on the ground. It is also important that on the use of various communication tools and methods, these are very much helpful, but the group wishes also to highlight the important role that email groups should be developed. And there should also be thematic email groups that would be very useful for the network. It was also proposed that there is an important need to be practical and ensure that WIN is effective. And there is need, therefore, to link effectively with existing networks and partnerships among and between indigenous peoples and local communities and other organizations from global, regional, to national levels. This would further strengthen solidarity for the implementation and support for indigenous peoples' rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the ILO 169 Convention, and all relevant multilateral agreements on human rights, environment, and sustainable development. This is our report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. I'm now going to invite my friend Gladman Chiberman from Zimbabwe, who's going to present the views from the African discussions. Gladman, if you'd like to join us, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Lalakia traditional owners of this land and the Commonwealth Government of Australia for allowing us as representatives of Indigenous and local community land and sea scape managers to be here and to be sharing. I'm making this statement on behalf of the African Caucus, who held a meeting today, and we were representing about 15 countries from Africa. As my friend John has just said, my name is Gledman Shibememe. I come from the Shibememe village in Zimbabwe, and I work with communities that are managing forests and are also involved in sustainable agriculture, environmental awareness, and policy advocacy. But for the purpose of this presentation, we discussed as an African caucus, and we came up with what we consider to be the building blocks or the key messages in terms of what we consider to be critical for Africa. The first message or building block is that we as African delegates, we greatly value the WIN conference and its major themes, which spoke directly concerning our needs and aspirations. We were able to associate ourselves with a lot of discussions that were going on here. But we highlighted also that African development and the concern for conservation has to be done in a holistic manner. In this case, we are saying when should the network has to be run in such a way that it doesn't promote the fragmented approach to conservation, but a holistic way in which we undertake our conservation activities. This is because in an African perspective, conservation deals with poverty. It also deals with issues of health. It also deals with identity, culture, and issues of sustainable, customer sustainable use of resources. So for us, WEN has to approach conservation and our initiatives in a holistic and integrated manner. The secondary recommendation has been that we have to be able to define our own destiny and our development path as Africans. So in whatever institutional mechanism, in whatever regional and international fora, we expect to have representation of representatives of African who are able to also voice our concern in terms of the development path that we expect as Africa. We also noted that in Africa, we have got a very rich traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge that we have. And more often, our governments have been emphasizing on the Western scientific knowledge as opposed to traditional knowledge that has been tested through millennia to be effective. Because all the biodiversity that we are talking about today is existing because they have been managed by the indigenous peoples of Africa. So in this case, we are emphasizing that in the context of when indigenous knowledge systems should be taken on board, and we need to integrate it with science. We don't need to stigmatize and trivialize indigenous knowledge system of the Africans. It is very important because even if you look at the concept of protected areas, it has got strong roots from sacred areas of the African people. We also realized that community networks and community learning is key for Africans because as Africans, we learn through communities, sharing stories under a tree, the campfire approach. So if the WEN network or the World Indigenous Network will adopt community-to-community networking and sharing of information, either within Africa and also with other communities in Australia, in Canada, that will add value to our efforts on the ground. We also realize that it's important to build the capacity of indigenous and local communities in Africa, capacity in various areas, and this is only possible if we have an enabling policy environment. And in this case, we envisage WEN as a tool or an approach to try to enhance or to inform our our various governments in the best way to revise their policies so that those policies will have a positive impact on the work of indigenous and local communities. We also realize that very soon Australia is going to host the World Parks Congress, the 60th World Parks Congress. And one of our recommendations was that the Australian government and the IUCN should work towards ensuring that the messages that have been given here are also disseminated at the 60th World Parks Congress. And therefore, we recommend that a community space, dialogue space, be created at the World Parks Congress for indigenous land managers and sea managers to share with policymakers there. Last but not least, we also shared the fact that the African people are closely associated with their biodiversity. By separating the people from their natural resources and biodiversity, you are exacerbating poverty. So in any attempts that any methodology or modus operandi that we are going to undertake as well, we have to make sure that the indigenous peoples and local communities are not separated from their biodiversity, and that the colonial legacy that has been perpetrated in most African countries where indigenous and local community institutions and tenure systems have been relegated and trivialized should be should be a story of those centuries. We perceive that we are in a new generation, and we have actually to have a paradigm shift to move from the old school of thought where conservation is thought to be protecting biodiversity from the people. We have to move away from a methodology where conservation is perceived to be fences, fines, and firearms. I thank you.
Gladman, you're a pretty hard act to follow, I have to say. Gladman, thank you for that. Now I'd like to invite a report back from the Pacific and Europe, and Tardar Lotan from New Zealand will present, but later on Johan Vasara will join him when we get some questions at the end of this session. So welcome, Tardar.
Ti hei mauri ora. Ti hei uriuri, ti hei nako, e ara te ao, e ara te pō, e ara i ngā mana i rere mai nei, ti hei mauri ora. Nā te mea kua tangihia ngā tangi ki te tāmati. Me ki kua e te rā taha. Nō reira, aku rangatira, ngā mata waka. Hurino o te ao, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nei rā te mihi aroha ki te haukainga, ara te larakia. Tēnā koutou, ka tira, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Tardar Lotan. I'm from the Ngāti Kaupata tribe in New Zealand. I work for the Department of Conservation, and I've got the privilege of reporting back from the Pacific group. The first point that we concluded from our discussion was that future frameworks for WIN will depend on funding and needs to be considerate of Pacific countries which may not be able to contribute to or host future conferences such as this. That consideration should be given to allowing local communities to take on secretarial functions with contributions from other nations. We felt that Australia should be part of the Pacific. We also felt that WIN should advocate for companies operating in affected regions to contribute through their social programs to assist with funding the Secretariat. A big consideration should be given to cultural values. These need to be elevated and considered in the framework. And other programs should be explored to determine whether there are funding opportunities to support WIN. Our suggestion also was that the Pacific Conference should be developed or should be held to develop a plan that would fit into the larger international context, and that the WIN Conference should be held every 4 years with the PIN, the Pacific Indigenous Network, Conference being held every 2 years, and this is to prepare for global discussions. Also suggested that there should be a domestic, regional, and international network conferences to assist to develop this concept, particularly across the Pacific. And that the European states and other governments should be encouraged to provide financial contributions to WIN. We think that in future, more workshops and network spaces should be made available so that we can talk and add value to those things relating to the ranger issues. Some of the things that we felt were missing at this conference. And we came to an agreement that a secretariat for the Pacific Indigenous Network would be based and would be currently operated by the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. And finally, we had the honor of having the European group join us, and they contributed greatly to this discussion. Nō reira, raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, ka tira, tēnā tātou katoa.
Okay, I'd now like to welcome from the Latin American group, Alberto Mulatto from the Honeycomac people in Mexico.
Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to give you the report from the Latin American Discussion Hub. And I would like to start saying that we have a big barrier to interact with the conference itself, which was language. Language limited our understanding for all those indigenous people that came from Spanish-speaking areas. So we had a hard time trying to catch on the ideas and presentations and the meaning of the WIN conference. But we came up with a list of suggestions that we would like for the conference in the future, for the network, which is number one. We would like to have culture as the base for the exchange and gathering, which means that the way that indigenous people share knowledge and experiences and struggles are when you come to somebody's house, when you meet their family, have their food, and then you talk to each other, and you experience one day of their everyday life. And another is that it's a proposal on make an addition on territory in the assets that will rule the win for the future. Territory meaning a struggle, a fight. We want the WIN network to be an advocate and push in every indigenous, in a national level, in every indigenous community to fight for their land. Because without land, you have no place to develop your culture. Regarding time, we would like to have more time for authentic exchange and discussion workshops. We would like the WIN network to be the communications platform for all of the indigenous groups, so we can share forums, spaces, and all those events where we can fight for what we are standing for. Governance. We would like the WIN conference to have a governance structure based on indigenous people. And whether it is an advisory board or a board, we would like to be part of that. Regarding language for the future, we would like to have more translations on every single session so we know what's really going on. And we propose that the WIN network to be divided by geographical regions and then subdivided in national levels until it goes to the local communities. We would like to name national delegates for the WIN and until a local level, local delegates for WIN. Seriously, we have to make every dollar to be valuable. It's so expensive to be here, and we have to come out with something on our backpacks when we are going back home. We are proposing to make a list in advance of the next WIN network gathering of topics from our regions. Things that are priorities to our people will be the priorities of the network. And we would like a space for ancient, traditional, tribal, or indigenous knowledge, too. We would like the WIN network to push the governments and institutions to really recognize traditional knowledge at the same level as Western science. We would like the WIN network to look after the indigenous rights applications in every single place in the world. And we came up with a phrase that says, the closest you are to your native culture, the farther you are from Western conferences. So I would like to acknowledge all of the indigenous people that really made an incredible effort to convey their messages, and we really appreciate that. It's hard to come up with something specific in a practical way for the WIN network when we had all those issues that we struggle with, especially language. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. Now I'd like to invite from the North American regional discussions, Anne-Marie Sam from Canada and Charles Pell from Alaska, the US. Thanks.
First and foremost, in all Native and Indigenous peoples, we would like to extend a great deal of gratitude to the Indigenous people of Australia and specifically of this homeland that we're now presenting on. It's our custom to acknowledge that, and traditionally, I wouldn't be able to step foot on your land unless I had been given permission by one of your elders, and it's a formality that we like to recognize, and we, in my language, thank you as hawa, So I say hawa to the Lakira people. We had a long discussion on the complexities of what WIN faces. We concluded that there's a need for more time to converse and to weed out the different ideas of how we're going to proceed forward, that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done towards designing a proper framework so that Indigenous people are able to get their message out about what their issues are and about how we as a conference or as a network can support their claims. We also discussed the idea that we need to include elders. We, at least from my people, we don't have any elders represented here, so the knowledge that they carry isn't being transferred to the rest of everybody else here. So we need to learn how to get our elders involved in this, whether it's they pass along the messages through the representatives or we get an elders forum together. But transferring that knowledge to the next generation is key to what needs to be a principle to win. We also agreed that we needed to develop a binding document that is a living document. We need to come up with bylaws that is written by Indigenous people, not governments, not the UN, but it needs to be written and implemented by us. We need to set priorities on the varying Indigenous issues that we see as important. Because of the time frames that we're able to do these conferences is very narrow. So we need to kind of come up with themes for how we proceed forward as a people. We need to narrow down the discussion so that we could properly give attention to some of these concerns. The network is going to only be as strong as the people that are participating. We need everybody to agree to issues and to agree to respect the ideas and the cultures of everyone present. So the idea that we need to work together and we need to support each other and take a step forward together. We talked about the Secretariat and how it doesn't need to be locked in any one place in the world, that it should be by our recommendation, and I hope that several other areas agree, that it needs to be a multinational board where we have an advisory board that helps to govern where this conference and the network goes in the future. Those were my talking points.
Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Larrakia people territory that I'm speaking on today. My name is Anne-Marie Sam. I'm from northern British Columbia in Canada. The points that I have in front of me are: it's important to share skills and knowledge, to incorporate them into the program, and to be able to prioritize at the local level. Somebody had mentioned earlier the idea of having regional sessions before we come to the bigger session. I think we were thinking that was very beneficial. There was a lot of discussion and concern about with WIN being taken over by the UN, with the common theme being lack of resources, relationships with government and industry, similar challenges, and not receiving benefits. We need to work with each other and not be played off against one another. And also, it was brought up the issue of funding. If we were to get funding for WIN, would that take away funding for the local groups and grassroots organizations? And so how do we prevent that from happening? We need to use the network to find a collective voice to influence change. And it was very, very clear in our discussions that we need to make government accountable, and we need to see that there's changes happening that benefit Indigenous people. need an advisory body to pursue information before decisions are made. And so how that advisory is made up, we just didn't have a discussion about that. And WIN has the capacity to set up multicultural initiatives that are culturally sensitive and consider the capacity, needs, and language considerations of Indigenous people. And a final point on financing, and I don't know if the lady I was having lunch with who was from Australia is in the room. I can't see, but she came up with a great idea of crowdsourcing. So if there's 1,200 delegates here, I know there was a cost to get people here, but she said for those of us that have jobs and are able to contribute, if 1,000 people gave $20 each, that would be $20,000. And if we did that 3 times a year, you would slowly start being able to fund the conference with our own sustainable funds. And so I just want to thank her for that idea and put that out to the group. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love that good practical advice. Thank you so much. Of course, now I have the pleasure to invite Nolan Hunter to the stage to report back on the discussions from Indigenous Australia. Thank you. Thanks, Nolan.
Okay, Chrissy Grant will also go through a rundown of our discussions. Thank you to the Larrakia people. We were fortunate earlier on in the week to get a special little tour that took us out in the harbour and got the opportunity to hear some more about Larrakia country, so thank you for that. Look, we ran out of time. There were a number of issues that people wanted to talk about, and it was unfortunate because there were a lot of people that wanted to, raise things, and we just ran out of time. One of the I guess for me, the issue, there was no issue around the importance of networking, knowledge sharing, and I think the takeaway message was that whatever occurred through the networking needed to be a grassroots process. And when I looked at some of the issues that were being raised, personally I came to the conclusion that this is symptomatic of other issues within our own country in Australia for Indigenous peoples. And it's unfortunate that we didn't have more time to go into that. In the short time that we did have, we had some notes taken around what we thought were the important issues. There was discussions on the importance of involving youth, looking at existing networks in Australia, established structures and processes that had occurred before, and I think the need to then find a way to incorporate that into the forward thinking around the network development. And I think Mr. Hooper, I'm sorry if I don't have that correct, raised a previous, some work that had been done previously. It was unfortunate that we didn't have a lot of time to go into a lot of that, but the idea is that with some of the concerns that were being raised, I think we can't disregard that, and so we need to find a way to incorporate that into any future planning that we do around the development of the network in the future. But for now, Chrissy will go through a summary of what we did manage to get in the short time that we had, and I'll hand it over to Chrissy.
Thanks, Nolan. Time is one of those things that we never have enough of, and for this particular exercise there wasn't enough time, and I'm sure it's for the Australian mob just as much as for the other groups that met around this important topic. But there was support in the room for the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander membership of the World Indigenous Network. As Nolan said, it was agreed that the WIN initiative should be developed and led from the grassroots level. And that grassroots is by Indigenous people in land and sea management for Indigenous people working on the country. There was also agreement for Indigenous people of Australia to have a strong and informed voice in the future development of the WIN, that we need to get our own house in order and improve information sharing and communication across our country. The principles guiding the WIN need to identify closely with Indigenous intellectual property and cultural values, considering existing frameworks and initiatives. A future network needs to be relevant locally, regionally, nationally and internationally, and link into the bigger picture globally. The Equator Initiative should take on an interim role in developing WIN, with a focus on international exchanges. The vision and framework for WIN should be developed by its members through representation from Indigenous people from participating countries. There was strong agreement that youth, as Nolan has mentioned before, should have a voice at the table as the future custodians of our land and seas. Our partnership with the Equator Initiative in this formative stage is an exciting opportunity for Australia as a developed nation to engage and work more with United Nations agencies in this space. There is a need for more discussion with governments and key partners to how we build an effective, enduring and sustainable network. More time is needed to engage with Indigenous people to develop the vision, framework and mechanics for the network, and consultations are continuing. There is an opportunity to do this when you go away from this conference today and you think that you might need to add something else, that you can add that on the website. And those questions are within that document, the scoping paper, and please feel free to continue to be engaged in this discussion and add any further comments. Thank you.